Well, hello and welcome to Building Matters, the Lignacite podcast. My name's Giles de Lotbiniere, I'm chairman of Lignacite, and I'm delighted to be bringing you the very first in a series of discussions exploring topics relating to architecture and the construction industry. The theme of today's episode is laying the foundations for a sustainable future. And we're going to be discussing the steps that we as an industry must take to design and build more sustainably. I'll be asking the panel about the issues relating to sustainability from education and the supply chain through to governance and accountability, trying our best to make sense of this complex topic. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Vanoli, partner at AMA Chartered Architects, Adam West, director of CZWG, and Nick Franks, the chief operating officer at Lignacite. So let's start at the beginning and talk about education. How much are architects and designers taught about sustainability during their training? Michael.
We were having this discussion earlier, and actually, if you go back to when I went through education, fairly little. There was an understanding that something had to be done, but it was more based on energy use rather than the specification of suitable materials. It is only once you pass your degree level, certainly at my time of education, you could then specialise, you could go into a specific tutor group, and that tutor group would be led by a number of tutors that may have an interest in a certain field. One of them could have been climate change, one of it could have been relating to technology in terms of using computers to generate ideas. But sadly, at the time that I went through my education, very little. Having spoken to other members of staff, colleagues, contemporaries, it has shifted. There is a greater interest, of course, but I'm not entirely convinced that actually the education system has taken a full grasp of this and entered it into the syllabus within education. I don't know what involvement you've had with schools of architecture or other departments relating to architecture, but we see, certainly based in Cambridge, it's a specialism rather than it being mainstream.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think my education was probably very similar to Michael's. It was of an interest to to quite a few of the tutors there at the school I was at, but it was a passing interest, and it wasn't until till very, very recently that any students have come to our practice with any kind of interest, or maybe not interest, but certainly any education which has got any basis on sustainability. We've got a girl, she's an architect now, who is involved in research, sort of really kind of scientific end of sort of biotechnology, and that's her own interest, and she's pursuing that, and we're very interested to see where that takes her. Another girl who has been who's just sort of finished, she's with us now, and she actually used Revit to measure carbon in the project she was doing. But I think that was, again, probably her... No, I think that was actually the school that actually pushed them in that direction. But I know other schools where they're only just starting to think about it. It's certainly not standard practice. And I think the further you can go, as you get to diploma level, you can forget all about it if you want.
So are you getting some education now from CPDs, or where do you learn about sustainability?
Well, we're constantly learning. I know it sounds cringeworthy, but we are constantly learning all the time. So on a day-to-day basis, in terms of researching a particular product, then naturally we're gleaning information from, it'll be a website or sales literature. In terms of getting further education from a structured arrangement, generally it's through CPDs, webinars, or I'm still old school, I will still take an architectural periodical, pick it up, or it could actually be a trade journal of some sort, and you gather and garner information from that. And occasionally, even when you have a sales representative come in, you meet with them and they provide a certain amount of information. Although having gone through that transition of having, as a result of the pandemic, everything seems to be online. It seems to be favoured to actually have CPDs over at lunchtime or early morning, and you pick up your information that way.
I think the challenge really is getting that information disseminated across the office. You know, we have a team who are interested in it, and we're looking into, you know, how we can disseminate the information, and we're involved with Architects Declare, and they run a series of courses, and there are other sort of organised ways of, you know, getting that knowledge. But it's actually really complex. So you tend to target the areas that you need for the projects you're working on. So you know, it can end up being quite specific. But that broader knowledge is something which we need to get the whole office interested in.
I think also just to drop back to the education side of things slightly, one thing that architectural education fails at is giving students the opportunity to have hands-on. We've noticed, as a result of a number of students coming from Central European countries, there is a requirement that they have to work on site, regardless of gender, for a period of time. And having these students either through an internship or have stayed with us, we find and have noticed that their understanding of how the building is put together is far greater than those that have come through the UK system. I'm not suggesting it's a huge failing, but it's encouraging to note that they have been able to appreciate, for argument's sake, how a brick is laid one on top of another, how a block is laid, how you would actually fix timber. And I think that grassroots level of understanding of material component, the physicality of what it is that they're looking to use is desperately important. Everyone knows what a block is when you go into School of Architecture, but they don't necessarily know the strength of it, its potential use. It could just be used as a facade. It could just be used structurally. It could be beneath the ground, and therefore that's what's important at an education level. And in terms of sort of picking up on the CPD aspect, naturally the RABA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, they have a seminar system in which you ensure you carry out your certain hours per year and topping up your level of continuing professional development. But it's not just that we need to rely on. There's information that's coming and can be gleaned from you as well, which is desperately important.
Yeah, I think on the sort of projects that a lot of the projects we have in our office, which are very large-scale design and build projects, getting onto site is actually quite difficult.
Yes.
You know, that's a real challenge. So it's really nice to hear that there are places where that's really valued. But we do find that on big projects, the contractor is less keen to have young architects wandering around site very often. And well, in the last 2 years, it's been really difficult.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
So that's that's really fantastic to hear that.
But it's also from the other side, you know, from the suppliers into the building construction industry. We're not educated on sustainability. We come from different aspects: sales, marketing, production, operations. None of those have a base in knowledge of sustainability. So we are, in actual fact, having to invest in the knowledge, whether it be specific people that have specific accreditations or education that is on a sustainable basis, or we are ourselves having to go out and get re-educated, re-accredited to enable us to have that conversation and understanding. So when we do sit down with someone within the trade, we have some confidence in what we're saying. Because at the moment, as our own business, we are very much at the beginning of our sustainable path in trying to get where we are by 2030. And part of that is actually getting educated first and what we should be talking about, what we should be doing. And that is also something that's a groundswell. It's going to have to happen through younger people coming through the industry with that education behind them. And we're actually looking at the younger generation to tell us at this level what we should be doing and taking that forward with them. And that's something that's going to have to gain momentum if we want to get to this.
That's a bit of a worry, isn't it? Having started that first question when we said it's very hit and miss. But you're absolutely right. Everybody, I think we're all learning. And I think really what's happened in the last few years, there's been a massive shift to, carbon, the climate emergency. The education that we had where we did learn about sustainability, or it wasn't called sustainability at the time.
No.
There's no mention of carbon. What's carbon? What's that got to do with building buildings? Sun, heat. That's very understandable, but and it's incredibly complex. I think we learn a lot. Actually, and I think it's going to increase from engineers, who can actually fathom what an EPD actually means. We need things translated into pictures and graphs and diagrams, I think, to work. As
again, I to contribute to that. Certainly, in the past, it's working with engineers that have been incredibly dynamic.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have some affiliation with a college or a university in some way, and actually do a teaching program there. I'm not wanting to mention any names, but there have been a number in the past that are at the forefront of wanting to push the boundaries in terms of material use, in terms of getting the best, whether it be concrete, whether it be timber, whether it be blockwork as well. And I just want to drop back to what you were saying as well, in terms of you wanting to not necessarily play catch up, because certainly as a company I think you have always been very good to keep your finger on the pulse and what's happening. But where were you getting that lead from? Because whilst we're getting it from, I guess to a degree, a major client would want a building to be developed to a specific level. It may be BREEAM assessed on housing. It used to be homes. I've forgotten what it's called now. Sustainable homes arrangement, or it might even be for passive house. But were you getting the lead from the pressure that we as designers, as specifiers, saying you need to do this? Was it from developers saying, actually, we need to do it? I suspect not, in terms of housing developers. Or was it the change in marketplace that was starting to occur from shift by government wanting to ensure a greater level of sustainability?
It wasn't from developers. I think right from the start in the company, we've always erred on the side, if you like, of producing a sustainable product, which is why we put wood into our blocks. It would be interesting to know from your point of view who is driving the sustainability agenda at the moment. Is it the client? Is it the government? Is it you as architects?
Well, we have a responsibility naturally to ensure that we are providing that early advice to a client, whoever that may be. As a practice, in the early 1990s, we did an office scheme and had got a green award, one of the first available at the time. But that was very much on the basis of using renewable materials, and again, dropping back to energy use. It wasn't using sustainable materials. It then sort of fell by the wayside very slightly, and it wasn't until one of our bigger clients, the University of Cambridge, they were being forced by the government to have their buildings accredited through the BREEAM process, and therefore as a result of that's when it started to trickle through as a greater level of importance. But naturally that is often led by budget, it's often led by programme, to a lesser extent to where the building is actually going to be positioned, its location, because there are certain elements within BREEAM that you go through almost a tick box arrangement. But sadly, there is this constant shifting of sands in terms of procurement, in terms of availability, in terms of cost. I think everybody has a willingness to accept and adopt a sustainable approach to however they build. But once it actually gets through the planning process, detailed design, and then costed, that's when thought needs to be given. The dirty word value engineering comes out, which is, do we look to make savings in certain areas? And regrettably, the cost of certain materials will be prohibitive, will prevent that from going through. Unless you've got a client that is very hard fast in wanting to achieve the various levels that they were committed to begin with. We developed, and many architects have, and I'm sure as well, Adam, you've got something similar, a matrix, whether you want to go for a standard, innovative, pioneering or something beyond that. And that very quickly gives an indication of the level in which we as designers pitch in with any design. Unfortunately, there's no costs associated with that at that particular stage. That doesn't happen until it goes through the sort of early budget estimates. But again, it's not truly reflective.
No. The majority of our clients are house builders, developers, or sort of, city centre, mixed use regeneration type projects. And I have had conversations with a number of clients who have, started out at being said, we are not being innovators, we are not pushing the boundaries. Their priority is cost. And increasingly it's hard to argue against that. There was a time where maybe you could have maybe massage it a little bit more, but there wasn't an interest in it because it didn't bring the value added. And I think now, and increasingly going forward, that's where we have to try and persuade them, the ones who aren't buying, building and keeping their stock, who are selling it on and then can just walk away, to actually persuade them that actually it's worth it. People will pay for it now. And hopefully the cost difference will get smaller, like it has done for PVs. Housing associations who are building for their, for the long term, developers who are going to keep their buildings and run them, need to keep finding people to rent their office space or whatever. They will be interested and they will be pushing for it because it's a really positive selling point. So although it's definitely shifting.
Sometimes it's I wouldn't say it's hard to convince, but there has to be good justification. Using the registered landlord analogy, years ago, trying to convince them to shift from a UPVC window to a timber window. But they were saying, well, it's maintenance-free UPVC. Well, actually, it's not. If you carefully detail design, the profiles relating to the timber window, actually what you're talking about is something that's going to be far better for the planet, and your maintenance strategy isn't going to be so bad. I think as a result of the climate change that's now so very evident, we're experiencing now going through heat warnings that are coming out in the news at the moment. When it comes to considering how we're constructing a home, a dwelling, we need to consider that it has to be able to prevent that heat build up within the building. It can't be done just by insulation alone. It has to be done by thermal mass. Once upon a time it was a case of timber frame. That's the way to go because it's erected very, very quickly and we can introduce the insulation. Actually, it's better to have some thermal mass there because in terms of internal environment it's far better. As a result of that, you're then not relying on any way of cooling, whether it's passive or artificial in some way. There are clients that are starting to awaken to that, which is good. But regrettably, it's all about hard and fast cash. It's about getting something churned out as quickly as possible. And our role within that design process sometimes falls upon deaf ears, sadly.
I think of late, the only shift I would say to that has been fire safety.
Yes.
Obviously, since Grenfell, there's been an absolute, paradigm shift across the industry in terms of the importance of that, which has actually been really helpful. Everybody is now working to the same kind of agenda. They all understand why it's important. They're not trying to cut corners. There's none of that going on now. That really helps. I fear the climate emergency is a much more slow burn. Sorry about that pun, but it's people are not going to grasp that problem, and I think the challenge for us as architects really is to not be weighed down by that. It can be terribly depressing. And we don't want that. It can be an optimistic way of looking at how we develop and how we design, how we build things. How do we just understand what's actually happening and work with it in a positive way?
The climate is such a broad stroke discussion point, whereas with fire, you're saying with fire, it's a very specific answer to a very specific question. When we come to climate and so on, it's such a broad stroke discussion point across all construction that trying to get the engagement to make that change is going to be one of the hardest. We've all got to get to the same spot on the road, so to speak, to say, well, this is the most important thing to us all now. And it's going to be differing for different sectors within the market, from your side, from your customer and client base, from our side, which is the supplier base. It's all going to be at different levels. And until we get aligned and get across the line together, you're not going to have that collective discussion that says, this is the solution we need to get to, because everyone's got their differing starting points. And I think that's one of with more noise and the media attention and client interaction, there will be more noise towards this. And as we get closer and closer and further away from this date into the future, it will become a bigger noise. But we're not really all in the starting blocks at the same place.
Sadly, that's great if it works.
Yeah.
If it's adopted that way, but sadly, invariably, it's not until our arms are twisted, our hands are twisted, and push that particular direction. Car travel is one. We're in a situation where the cost of fuel is going up, and therefore there's people using greater use of transport or purchase of EV vehicles. It's not until we start to deplete some of the resources that we realise actually we can't keep taking this out of the earth, and therefore we've got to look at different ways of being able to manufacture, whether it's block, whether it's brick, whatever it may be, in the process of developing a component within our built environment. I don't think it works where you're going to get to a point where just the moral, the principle of the thing, people are going to adopt it. Is it going to be government-led? We've seen some of that in the past with some of the accreditation systems which we spoke of earlier, BREEAM, Passive House. But before that, there used to be the planning Merton rule in terms of the percentage of renewables you're expecting to see on a development. That I wouldn't say necessarily has fallen by the wayside, but the controlling aspect of that, the constraining aspect of that has loosened somewhat in terms of the terminology. It's not until we're hit by that wall in front of us are we going to find, and again it's unfair to say clients, but it's the general public, because they are our client ultimately, wanting to make that commitment. And yes, there's an element of the generational thing that creeps into this. We didn't necessarily experience it during our tertiary education. We were fortunate with the architectural education we had an element of it. We were made aware of it. But now, obviously, there is an insurgence that's coming through where they are acutely aware of it. And I think it's gone through general education. You know, I can remember my two coming back from their school saying about recycle, reuse, the 3 Rs, and I'm going, oh, I've not heard of this bit before. So it's good. It's encouraging that's happening, and therefore, as a consequence, hopefully there will be the leading light. I'm not saying it needs to be another generation that sorts it out. It is all of our problem. We're all responsible for this, and I think as architects, as manufacturers, you're doing your bit. It's the take-up that's needed by others when it goes through the supply chain.
Yeah.
It's one of those, if you take the EV analogy, you had rising costs, you've got legislation telling us we ought to be not using petrol, but then they gave us the incentive, the carrot that says if you buy an EV vehicle, you'll get subsidised, because we know it's more expensive than a standard car. That part hasn't come into this. You know, there's no subsidies or no incentives for innovation to happen, because we know at the moment it sits on your side of the table, says you've got to tell your client it's now 25-30% more expensive because we're using these types of materials.
But I think that's the difficulty. It was always going to be sitting on the other side of the table, isn't it? Until someone actually steps up to the line and goes, right, we need to do this. And all of us need to go, right, we do need to do this. We need to make that change rather than being forced down a particular avenue.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though, because you're talking about, renewable energy and that need to sort of, to provide more, on site rather than the. I mean, the GLA are actually probably one governing body that is pushing that agenda, and they make demands sort of on buildings. They're way beyond nationwide sort of planning requirements, but they can afford to do it. it comes back to cost again. In London, values are at a level where you can put 35% more energy, on site if you need to get the planning permission. If you're looking in Manchester, the costs of actually, or the values of what you build are a third of what they are in London. So how can you afford to do that? There isn't that big a difference in build costs. Supply materials between Manchester and London. It's that land value. So it does come back to being pushed along that route, whether it's incentives to buy through feedback tariffs with PV sales originally. Cost of PVs has come right down now, and that's actually not necessary. Electric vehicles, the same thing has happened. That shift has happened, and at some point it will. That change will happen. But the reality is we've still got to deal with all our existing stock.
Very good. I had a meeting with a client yesterday, lives in a Victorian villa in the centre of Cambridge, and we were talking about looking at going a sustainable route. Well, where do you start with a house? They're doing it in a and very good. They're doing it in a piecemeal fashion. They're looking at their windows first, but then of course there are constraints relating it to being conservation area. So therefore you've got to consider the design and what's available to them. But if you're looking, and we're going to energy use here, but if we're looking to go for an air source system, where do they put them? How do they change the operation within the central heating system within the house? So it becomes very problematic. We are relatively unique as a nation that our housing stock ranges from a 15th century cottage rectory all the way up to a 1970s previous council house.
I think we've got more than any other country in the world, I think, of old.
So therefore, how do you retrofit? But it's sadly that's not what we're talking about today. No, there's another topic of conversation, but it's still a very valid one that needs to be overcome. Yeah. And it's about insulation, and it's about ensuring, energy loss again, but we're not losing that heat through the fabric of the building, and ideally we're not overheating the building when we're experiencing temperatures that we're experiencing at the moment. And again, sort of swing it back to blockwork, that is very much in your favour. You've got the opportunity here to without selling your product, but you've got an opportunity here to sell a product that is carbon neutral. It can, I would suggest in a few years' time, it can even be manufactured from a product that can carbon capture as well, and then provides something that is going to be evidently providing an environment that is going to be good to live in. I'm talking housing here, but of course that also goes back to commercial buildings as well, whether it's high rise, whether it's low rise or not.
So as manufacturers, it's very important for us to get on the bandwagon with the sustainable agenda, but there's also a lot of greenwash around. So how do you as specifiers know what genuinely is a sustainable product, and how do you ensure that that's the one that gets specified?
With great difficulty. I'm not sure about how you come to specify things. It generally is either a thorough research, it's been tried and tested, it's gone through the mill previously, and we know there's a chain of custody there that supports the product successfully. Whether there should be anything else that's there, I don't know whether there is a stamp that could be applied to it. What would be very useful from a specification point of view, most of you use NBS, the National Building Specification Tool, whether they ought to go around and go, it's a broad area to cover, a huge marketplace to cover, but whether they give it some rating. Years ago there used to be the Green Guide to Specification, where you could quite easily pick up it wasn't so much a component but an element of a building, whether it's a wall, whether it's a roof, and if you chose this particular not product but element or component, it will give you a grading, and therefore that was our Bible, if you like, our go-to for a quick reference.
Yeah, I mean, it's still there online. They've got great long lists of A's and A+ kind of construction sort of systems. At the end of the day, though, I think very often as architects we're not purely looking for the, just a purely sustainable building. There are always other factors that, that matter. So I think it's always a matter of, where are the priorities, and you want something which is, which is as sustainable as possible, but there are always other factors. And what we don't necessarily tend to worry about too much is, is necessarily the delivery time when you're initially specifying it. Although, I mean, on a small project, it probably is on a project where the time frame is, in the next 6 months or a year. But where you're talking about big projects that are 2-3 years down the line, that's less of an issue. But I think increasingly sustainability is part, one of the issues is how local is it? Where is it being manufactured? And if it's being manufactured close to the site, particularly for a heavy project, then that's a positive. So I don't think that there's maybe in finishes, internal finishes and things, you might be looking at something where actually, products are clearly, they might be similar, but there's clear differences in terms of their sustainability. But very often I think, there are other factors which make that decision. But greenwashing is a real issue. It's amazing, every product out there, every material now has found some way that they're sustainable.
It's interesting what you're saying about distance. We, some years ago, were digging sand and gravel right here next to our plant, but we hadn't ticked all the boxes that we needed to. We were also importing material from China, and the Chinese manufacturer had ticked all the boxes. And from a sustainability tick box point of view, right, it was better for us to bring the material from China than from next to the plant. Yeah. Which has just got to be crazy.
Well, it is, and again, prior to starting, we were talking about the sort of timber specification. We are satisfied as designers to see that FSC certification, but actually it could be coming from Siberia, so we're not taking into account shipping costs or the journey by road. And I therefore, holistically, there needs to be some way of being able to assess this. And going back to the BRE Green Guide specification, whether it's the Bible, the hard book, or whether it's online, I'm not entirely convinced that they've gone to that level, that depth of research to determine whether it's taken into account. And wastage, obviously they're considering from a recyclability point of view, but I'm talking about wastage in terms of the manufacturing process. You're very good here, and lots of manufacturers are, in being able to recycle their material if it's of a particular quality or fails to meet a certain grade. But in some industries, that's not even taken into account. So that level of transparency needs to be sent through to all parties, not just as as designers, but it needs to be across the board. There needs to be somewhere, whether it's a centralised point where it can be held. Who is responsible for that is a different matter.
Yeah, I think recycling is a really important aspect now. Finding uses for old materials and being able to reuse it. I think steel is now that's becoming much more of a focus, because steel is obviously massively carbon intensive as well. So I think that is increasingly a use, and I know that obviously it's something that you've used for a long time, but finding new materials as we go forward that you can use in your blocks will, I think, be a real help in terms of making sure that digging holes and pulling stuff out of the ground doesn't become
from our perspective,
too expensive.
it's twofold for us. So you've got the sustainable product, so how sustainable is that product when it's been used in the building, and then you've got sustainable construction, which is, I might have the best sustainable product in the market, but if I've got to travel it 550 miles to get to you, it then becomes a non-sustainable product by the fact that you've used so much carbon to get there in the first place. So you almost have. I can see the confusion from your side, because it's like, I've got this really great product, but if I transport it to where I want it to be, it's then not. So I'm better off to have a compromise with a product closer to the location, because overall it's actually a better product to use. And how are you meant to judge that without knowing the geography, the product, the means of getting it there and back? If we suddenly went on water to you, it'd be a lot cheaper from a sustainable perspective to do it. So there is a lot of confusion in how you define your sustainable credentials, as much as what those standards are. Now, you could look at trade bodies that say, so like you said, you've got the FSC for timber. That's a recognised standard. Could concrete block manufacturers with their trade bodies have a standard? You know, those are the sort of things that you, from yourselves, the contractors and the clients are looking for, that says, I just want something where I can benchmark what I've got. So I know with some faith and confidence that what is stated that manufacturer A is providing me is benchmarked against the same way as manufacturer B is providing me.
But does your block, you know, the governing body for sorry, excuse me.
Something like the Concrete Block Association.
Okay, CBA. So are they actually putting something into place? Is there something in place?
So I don't want to commit, because they might well be.
Right.
But I can't say for here and now that I know they are. But they're the sort of things that maybe the manufacturers should be driving rather than the body driving to the manufacturer. We should be saying, look, we all agree that we are in competition with each other. I want to be competitive with my competition on a level playing field. I don't want to be sat down here thinking I'm really competitive because I've set myself this bar and someone else has set their bar there. I want us to have the same bar, so you on your side of the table go, yep, absolutely, I can understand now where the concrete block manufacturers are coming from, as you have done with timber. And that, even if it is different to glass, to fixture and fittings and everything else, as long as that particular category is being benchmarked the same way.
I suppose the difficulty is that you will then not have the level of technology or the advancement with the technology that's involved with either processing the product that you're doing, because everyone's going to go, well, we're all the same, and that's what we're going to churn out.
And that's where we used to have, like you said, we used to have trade or trade declarations, didn't we? You always used the trade norm, and now we're moving to EPDs, which means that we can provide you with our own personal or company credentials. But EPDs are, you can go to a multitude of different EPD companies to accredit what you're doing. So from your side, you go, that's great, but
how confident are we that it's been assessed appropriately?
It's standard, isn't it? It's a standard EPD that covers concrete blocks. But I think the great thing is that you're talking about everybody's trying to find ways of actually being more sustainable now. So that's a real positive. And there are certain manufacturers of products who will have an advantage. Whether it's because their forest that they're making their furniture out of is next door, or because they're next to a canal and can take it downstream. Whatever, people are looking to find those advantages and work with that. And I think it's those things that sometimes it sounds like a bit of a gimmick or whatever, but actually can make a real difference. It can be a selling point. I think there are going to be manufacturers who are struggling to find some sort of positive, and they're going to have to work a lot harder, and they might not achieve the same levels as everybody else, but they're going to improve the standard that they're at, and they're going to be moving. And then it requires the government to set sort of legislation to set a benchmark. Say, well, if you can't get to this level, we're never going to get to the 2030 sort of targets, and you're just going to have to stop working, and it's that kind of pushing up from the bottom. I think, and there'll be people out the front, and hopefully, if their product's popular and their cost is competitive, then there'll be the people.
No, from a manufacturer's point of view, if I've got the same specification or standard as other block manufacturers, I've got the quality of equal or better than my competitors, but then I have sustainable credentials that are superior to them. The question then is, how much more expensive can that block be before it becomes a non-block? If that makes sense. So ideally, you want it the same. You want to be I want the same cost, but I want the sustainable credentials, and we're all going to aim. And in 20, 25 years, maybe sooner, we might get there. But
we have to get there. I think
innovation is going to cost money to happen. Therefore, it has an impact on cost. But if we're talking 3 or 4%, you'll go, no, I reckon I can squeeze that one through. If you say 15, 20%, you go, oh, I'm not sure now. If I said 30%, you go, no, not a chance. Not a chance of that happening. So,
but there are other variables that creep into that as well, Nick. You've got, as is being experienced at the moment, people are paying hand over fist for materials. So it's being led a different route. It's the procurement route that's key. We need it now. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute they're turning a blind eye, and we don't care where it comes from and how it's manufactured. There is still a responsibility there, but it's the price is not the driving force.
Not the first question.
No. And therefore, I suspect that has always been the case pretty much when it comes to any green accreditation that's given to a particular material. It's been sitting there. It's always looming in the background. We as designers know that we have a responsibility to ensure that we put that forward as a solution or as a product that should be used. But invariably, it's going to be, well, what's available and how much is it? So therefore, very quickly, I know we've come full circle in terms of the conversation, but unfortunately, unless there is this pushing that needs to be done, 5% is going to be palatable. I would have thought in overall costs, there can be savings that can be found elsewhere. But unless you're actually getting to the point where, when it does creep up to 10% or 15%, there is no wriggle room. That's what you've got to use. That's what's got to be specified, and it's got to run all the way through the project and get delivered at the other end. Whether there are cost benefits or not, because we just can't carry on in the way that we're doing at the moment. One of the things that we were talking about outside, in terms of your raw materials, where they're coming from, at some point they'll become you go out and there isn't going to be anything left out there. So we're then having to look at biogenetics or biogen type materials, and that's available now, but it's very costly. And yes, you can have it so that it is carbon absorbing, which is fantastic. So there's a win-win scenario there. But the cost for that is huge. It's immense. And it's still got to go through its testing process as well in terms of its structural integrity, if we're talking about blockwork. And that's the difficult that we're all faced with. We have an ideal, of course we want to be able to specify this, but as it goes through the system, there is always going to be variables, facets that creep in that prevent it potentially of being laid, if it's a block, being nailed, if it's a piece of timber, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, from a block specific point of view, non-cementitious material is the next big goal for someone, and then being able to scale it up.
Yes.
That's not only to have like you are with Biogen, it's not so much the innovation itself, but it's the ability to scale it up and quickly to enable the industry to adopt it. And that's, I think, for our block manufacturer, that's the next big step. If there's a eureka moment in our industry, it will be to be able to make blocks without cement. Now, that almost sounds counterintuitive at this moment in time because it's one of the constituents. But going forward, that will be the biggest carbon and sustainable leap that blocks can make. And then you get into the ready-mix concrete, poured concrete, all the materials you use in a construction that have got cement in it, that can all be converted. That's the first biggest. And to me, that's non-cementitious for block and the alternative to fuel to get it there. They're the two big.
But in terms of media, this is going back to education, I suppose. But in terms of media, everyone is acutely aware of travel, the carbon footprint that we leave, driving cars, going away on holiday, taking flights, whatever it may be. But I don't think generally public are aware of how much energy is consumed to create housing. That's only most recent as it's starting to be fed through. Concrete, cementitious products, that's the second most consumed resource globally.
Yeah.
It's not travel. We all, from building homes, the impact of building homes is great. It's been within our, we're aware of it because we're in the building industry, building professionals, manufacturing, whatever it may be. We're aware of it, but I'm not sure that's trickled down to the person that's turning the key into their new home. They want to make sure their appliances are A-rated, and perhaps they want to make sure now that they've got a plug-in supply to charge their vehicle, and they know that they haven't got a gas boiler. But what they don't know is how much energy's gone into the manufacturing of brickwork, in blockwork, in everything else, the plasterboard, the plaster, everything else that goes into it. Nor are they acutely aware of how much water goes into the building as well.
No,
it's only when you do individual level in homes and you sort of say to people, actually, there's an awful lot of water that comes into your home, to whether it be the mortar, whether it be the plaster, whether it be the paintwork, all of these things. You need to allow the building to dry out naturally. Don't force it, because it will shrink and you'll have all sorts of problems. So there is an educational level, and it's not just within the profession, within that industry environment. I think it needs to go further afield. There needs to be a lot more, whether it's in print, whether it's on television, whether it's media attention. Now, I guess what's good about this, because it will be posted, and people may just pick up on the fact, and therefore they become a little more socially aware of what their commitments need to be. Don't know. That's an ideal.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to, on top of that, I think people are aware of, of the amount of, building that happens, and I think they perhaps haven't related it to energy in the same way, but there are plenty of people there who are afraid that, the country's being overrun with, with buildings and things.
But that's only, I would suggest that's only a loss of land.
Yeah, exactly.
Loss of green
That's all
space.
they're interested in, really, is that loss of green space, which is and we were talking an awful lot about, energy and carbon, but sustainability is a massive subject, and it involves they're all interlinked, and it comes back to the sort of things that I think we were aware of when we were being educated, about the environment and and the biodiversity and so on, and those impacts. And I think that the real challenge is going to be actually for people to accept that, it's going to be a different, we're going to have to live differently. Yeah, and everybody knows about flying around the world, but nobody really wants to give up their holidays. No. Which is fair enough. And maybe one day, there will be, low energy fuels that can get airplanes around the world. But
Hydrogen.
Yeah.
Is blockwork considered to be a sustainable solution when you're building? Is it something that you go to and go, yeah, that ticks the box?
No disrespect. Once it wasn't.
Yes.
Once it wasn't, because we were talking timber frame, the speed of which a house could be built, using that as an example. But because of climate change, because of what we're talking about, and because of the climate that we're experiencing in the UK at the moment, this goes back to what was mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that we've got some sort of heat sink, that we've got an element of a cool environment in which to live overnight. We don't get that with timber frame housing technology, sadly. I think it's more present in housing possibly than high-rise accommodation, because you need that rigidity, you need that strength there, which you don't get.
The weight becomes an issue, obviously, when you're going high-rise.
And of course,
there's always
you've got the fire.
There's always the stuff in the basement and whatever. But the great thing about blockwork is everybody knows how to use it. Everybody understands it. It's great sound. It's great for fire. It's difficult to damage. Plasterboard wall. Vapor barriers. That all creates all sorts of problems that can be overcome with blockwork. Passive house. You insulate the outside of a building, and it's a great background to put your insulation on externally. So it does have definite advantages. It's just dealing with the details. That's a whole other issue. Thermal bridges and so on.
Trades. That's, again, without getting on to that level of
that's
topic.
The biggest challenge, actually.
Is finding the resource to be able to, for someone to lay blocks. We've gone through the sort of thin bed technology, or that, that was a buzzword, 5 years ago, maybe a bit more than that. Where have we got with that, actually? It's still traditional block, 10mm mortar bed.
I think your biggest challenge really is to get into the MMC market and start, manufacturing off-site, and being able to deliver finished, completed pieces of concrete, blockwork or whatever, rather than, building it on site, because that's a big push in the industry now, is for off-site manufacture, and volumetric house builders are building factories to build houses, but then they've got to, kind of transport these great big sort of
That's the
containers
difficulty.
of air back to
They've almost made
site.
a problem into a different place. I mean,
Yeah.
we used with the AFM products, we used to do panels. So you'd also have blockwork with a panel in front of it scenario. So it's kind of a smaller scale of what you're asking for, but it is the transport. You know, at what size do you want these panels to be, and it's that discussion. And where do you get innovation and in design more than product? Where do you get the innovation? You know, everyone's very good at producing a widget. So we produce a block, and we can produce 180,000 of them a day. But you try and ask for different size widget, and I want it this size, that size tomorrow, then it will go down to 50,000 blocks a day. If that makes sense. So, from a design point of view, off-site build is great, but how much design then you end up with a conformed product.
I think as a nation we have difficulty with that because off-site manufacturing techniques have been available, present, certainly within the States, some of the lowland countries as well, for a long period of time, whether it's a SIPS panel, the insulated system. But regrettably, because we have such a variety of housing stock in the UK, and as designers we like to be creative in developing something that is panelised, is very difficult. Yes, it's fine if you're rolling out something very similar, or you've got the economy of scale to doing that. When you draw down on smaller developments, it becomes very difficult in terms of integration. One-offs is very good. You've got the Hofhaus solution. Panelised system comes over from Germany. Everything has been considered and thought about, plugs in together, and away you go. You can live in the house within 6 days of it being erected on site or something equivalent. When it comes to the high-rise apartments housing that you do, perfect there, because you are churning out maybe 3 or 4, 6 or 7 types of units. Great. So therefore you've got the economy of scale. But it's when you come to speculative development where you need that variety, and ultimately the client is looking for that individual design of home. They don't want something that Mr. and Mrs. Jones has next door. Then it falls foul. It becomes very difficult to apply that. Yeah. Now, back in early 2000s, we did for a regional college in Cambridge, we did a facility to teach then trades coming through into the building industry, taught them how to build with off-site manufacturing techniques, MMC type products. Where have we got to now? How often do we see that? That was based on a SIPS panel solution. A pair of semis were built under a tent, and then they were dropped again, ready for the next year's influx of students. How many of those students that have gone through there actually have applied those skills, understanding how a SIPS panel is put together, getting it airtight, all the other elements that need to be considered? I'm sure they're back into traditional ways of building it, whether it be timber frame, whether it be blockwork, brickwork, those sort of things. There has been of late the metal frame solution that's coming forward. There is a house builder I'm aware of, regional house builder, that is actually manufacturing a plant to produce these panelised systems to be able to get it on site. But I haven't seen, they're churning out mass volumes, therefore there is a benefit to them, but I haven't seen anything else more recently. Haven't seen anything in terms of the sort of concrete solution so much.
There are
in
several,
the UK I'm talking about, sorry.
Yeah, volumetric, manufacturing plants being built by a number of house builders, and there are others who are moving to that, and I think it's labour shortages that's leading to that. There is one volumetric builder I know of who builds concrete boxes, and they're very successful. But they're useful for student housing because it's a smaller scale and you can actually transport that easily. What's been happening, and what we've been working with for years is pods for building bathrooms, and utility cupboards, and then balconies, things that you can hang on the outside, that sort of scale. But they challenge, they really struggle as well, and the numbers that go bust, over the years is quite remarkable, because it's all about, you need to get the product you need to know it's coming to the factory. It's all about supply, you know, and having it there and being able to build it and having that money to buy the things before you're delivering the finished product, which is what, you know, your client is paying for at the end of the day. There's that big gap in the middle. So it is happening, and it will increase. But I still think that, yeah, you know, bricks and blocks, simple things that people understand, so long as, you know, they are not contributing to global warming, or that, you know, that is reducing significantly, will still be there. Because, you know, at the end of the day, yeah, we're building, you know, thousands of flats in London and Manchester and sort of these urban places. We still need the local small scale builders, and, you know, and they can't build out of those.
There's flexibility aspect as well that needs
Yeah.
to be mentioned, because that's the problem with panelised, mass manufactured solutions. At some stage, a block of flats will remain a block of flats, that's for sure, but you may have a situation where, as a result of markets changing, a commercial office building may need to go back or revert to become residential, or vice versa. And certainly some of the research buildings that we get involved with, that's at the forefront. The flexibility has to be there, because that's constantly changing. There is always a requirement to either add something into the space or remove something in some ways. And if you're talking about a large piece of concrete panelling in there, how are we going to overcome that, you know, without serious demolition and disruption to the building?
Bricks and blocks have been around for a long time, are pretty simple, and are, as you say, very flexible.
Yes,
Yeah.
and, you know, why reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
As long as it can keep up with, and I call it current trends. Hopefully, it's not going to be a current trend, but in terms of it becoming a very sustainable product.
You know, there's a reason why bricks are size of a brick, you know, it's easy to use. And that, you know, people's hands aren't going to change size that quickly.
Although we can talk about robotics, but that's
yeah,
3D printing.
Yes. All right.
I think, you know, for many years people have been trying to find a way of being able to lay bricks and lay blocks, but, you know, as long as it's a straight line, it's fine. But as architects, we don't necessarily always want a straight
We don't
line.
always like straight lines, do we?
And the reason a block is the size of a block is it's 6 bricks.
Yep. See, that was taught to me at college or at university.
I know it's 6 bricks. I didn't realise that was the reason why.
Yeah. So it'll
Always.
fit in.
works.
Yeah. So the building industry in general is quite slow to change. We've touched on a lot about sustainability, but where do you see the future of sustainable building going?
I'm going to do a dirty trick. I'm going to pass that to
That's the
Nick.
first time you've done that.
Sorry to Adam. Sorry. It's,
I'd like to think that it will be something that people think about from the beginning and becomes an important factor in, you know, decision-making process. I think that's happening. What I'd like to be able to do is to think that have an optimistic view that we will carry on, you know, designing interesting buildings, that, you know, architecture will still, you know, enliven people's lives, and that the sustainability factor will kind of be critically important, but actually you won't have to feel like you've got to wear it, you know, out there on your sleeve. You know, it's taken as, you know, as fact. You know, that's what it is. You know, in a way, it's quite interesting. A few years ago, you know, cars, EV cars, everybody was coming out with these amazing, funky designs for driving an electric car. You know, the BMW i3 and the i8, which, you know, depending on viewpoint, look, you know, great or not. But now they look like normal cars, which is kind of boring in a way, but it's a positive sign in that, you know, people are able to kind of just accept it, and it's the way the future's going, and I think that's what needs to happen.
that is a positive thing to a degree.
Yeah,
Whilst there's a
exactly.
modernity to it, I suppose. Using that as an example, Yes, I suppose it was Emperor's New Clothes to begin with in terms of EV technology. Now we're knowing, because we're being forced to do that, we know that we've got to do something. There is this reaction. I suppose where we're coming from, we have to be seen to be proactive. We'd like to think that we're proactive about these things. So it's going to be very much a norm in answer to your question. In terms of the way, how do we see it developing? I think that's a very difficult difficult question to answer, because and with the material resource, with the climate change, are we going to end up building a lot more beneath the ground? You mentioned basements earlier. Are we going to do that as a race? I can't see that it's going to be something that actually happens. There's a population aspect that needs to be factored into this. What their needs are going to be. Do we get to a point where we evolve and can deal with the changes in temperature to a certain degree? You know, evolution is a wonderful thing, but that takes time. It takes a long time. So we have to adapt, and we are adapting as it stands at the moment. As designers, we are realising that we need to ensure that the buildings are as sustainable as they possibly can be, with the palette of materials, technology that's available in front of us. We're only as good as the manufacturers with their technology as well. Once upon a time, architects were utilising airplane technology in some of their designs. Well, actually, technology is caught up with that level of thinking to a degree, where they're thinking a bit further afield, out of the box slightly, and we're introducing that. But it has to be tried and tested, of course. Whether the home as a house type changes, I don't think so. Going back to what we were saying earlier with affordable housing or council housing, we prefer brick and block. Some of those landlords prefer brick and block. If you're talking about shared ownership, you've got to consider the mortgage lenders that are going to lend them the money to purchase that house, and they seem to be favoured to want to have a masonry form of construction over and above anything that may be unique. Because all the way through this, there has to be that factor of safety. There has to be a level of assurance to be able to accept it, to be able to sign off on it, to be able to provide funding, loans for it, for them to live in it. So if there is going to be a change, there has to be quite a significant change that happens quite quickly, rather than it being a slow process.
At the risk of slightly contradicting myself here, I think what I'm sort of really excited about is the opportunity to think about sustainable issues as being a way of actually maybe slightly changing the way, you know, buildings are built, and just thinking about providing, you know, something that's more exciting, interesting, and actually that principle being accepted as an approach. I think there are still an awful lot of people, sort of challenges that you can face in sort of in planning terms about, you know, sticking with the status quo and, you know, particular, you know, styles or solutions to ways things are being done, and actually thinking about, well, no, you know, for hundreds of years things have always been the same, you know, the climate, and things aren't changing, but things are starting to change now, and we need to think about how, you know, how our buildings adapt to this changing climate. And also just the fact that we can't just keep extracting things from the earth. We've got to actually think about redoing it. So it's a fantastic opportunity to, you know, to do something, you know, that's thinking a little bit, you know, outside the box, which is a real opportunity. But what you're saying about, you know, the way things have always been and what people like, I think you realise now, you know, I think the 60s was a sort of a real realisation that people still want, you know, the same traditional things, and, you know, that's not going to change significantly.
But it will have to change.
It will change slightly, you know.
Yeah, but it at some point it will have to change, and it's the planning system. You know, well, again, another topic of conversation here.
Yes.
Whilst certain things sit comfortably within a certain borough or district, that often gets accepted over something that may be quite innovative in design, in terms of its creative design. Invariably with the creative design, that's when boundaries are being pushed in using new technologies in material use. But the planning authority either do not have the control over that, because they're also having to adhere to certain policies as well. So therefore there's a reluctance to accept that. As a consequence, you've got the situation where house owners wanting to have something that is relatively traditional. There is a minority that's creeping out from that realise something needs to be done about it. But that goes back to what we were saying earlier again, which is the generational thing. I think that the younger generation, once upon a time, everyone bought a home by going in and tapping on walls. People are buying homes now online. No way would I think that would be accepted by any means. But as a result of going in, they are looking deeper into the terms and conditions of what may or not be allowed within that building in terms of development, what has been installed in that building, its energy efficiency, its EPC, whether there's the A-grade dishwasher or whatever it may be. So there is, as people are getting older, as the education is catching up with this, then they are starting to realise there needs to be change. And as designers, obviously, we have a responsibility to help that
change
forward.
In the right direction.
Yeah, we need to steer it in the right direction. And you as manufacturers need to either support us with providing whatever material it is that demonstrates that, or pushes it further and actually grabs us by the collar and say, look, we've manufactured this block over here, we've done it so well that it's the cost is equivalent to, use it. Inform your client, inform your developer if it's design and build that this can be used.
From a manufacturer's point of view, we will continue to invest and research innovation within our blocks, because it's our point of differential against our competition in some respects. In the nicest way, we continue to be competitive with our other manufacturers through our specification, our quality, our service, and so on. Sustainability is the next lever that's going to be used within the market. So for us to be competitive now, not only have we got to have the best block in regards to fit, finish, specification, accreditation, and so on, the next one now will be, and what are your sustainable values? Because we're all trying to get there, so we're all competing against each other to do that. So we can sit there and go, no, I can deliver you a sustainable block. This is what you need to use. You don't need, and in some respects, to defend against the off-site manufacturing by saying that's not as sustainable as using traditional block now. No, we are competing not only within our own category, but against other categories trying to move into our area. And sustainability is going to be one of those key battlefields in going forward. And we need to innovate, otherwise you're going to fall backwards. So,
well, it's going to percolate to the top. Yeah. It's going to have to, because this shift needs to take place.
So, from our point of view, we're committed to it. We have, and we'll always do. We've always been at the forefront of innovation and trying to get those done. That's the next stage. That is where we continue. But we've got to do it not as a compromise. Well, the one thing we can't do is say we've got a sustainable product, but to get that, you've got to compromise on this rating, that standard, that specification. You can't have that. That's now where we are. We now to add this to it, not give you a compromise, because you just sit there and go, well, that's not what we want.
But we're always, with every decision-making process that we go through in terms of product selection, there is always a balance that has to be weighed up.
Good. I'm going to gently draw us to a close, I think. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much, Michael, Adam, Nick. I hope anybody listening has found it interesting and picked up some good tips, and stay tuned for our next podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.